Turn this evening to Joshua chapter 9. This is a chapter with many varied lessons for us as we live the Christian life and seek to follow the Lord. I'm going to read verse 14, but there's so many associated lessons in this chapter. Joshua chapter 9, verse 14, concerning Joshua and the men of Israel. The men took their victuals, their provisions or food, and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. Well, this chapter is a warning to us, or this verse particularly is a warning to us to beware rash decisions and rash promises. Israel did here through Joshua. He was sincere in many ways, and yet there was a flaw in the decision-making progress. And so often we can fall into the same trap which Joshua and the princes of Israel did here. Now, chapter 8, we learned that Israel had come to Mount Ebal. They had renewed the covenant with Jehovah, and they pledged themselves to keep his ways. And chapter 9 begins really by saying that the Canaanites heard about it. The end of verse 1, and then again in verse 3 concerning the people of Gibeon. They heard, not that they heard about Jericho here, but they heard of the children of Israel making this covenant. They were in the land. By faith, they anticipated final victory and final conquest of Canaan. And there were two reactions here to that resolve. The first is that there were those that gathered together to resist. They gathered with one accord. They were united in their cause. Now, this is not really a lesson here, but it's a challenge to us. They had their cause. They had their interest. And they gathered as one. The Hivites, the Perizzites, the Amorites, and so on. When it comes to the Lord's battles and the Lord's people, are we as united in a good cause as these Hivites and Amorites were in their wicked rebellion? Sometimes the enemies of the Lord are more united in rebellion than the church is united in gospel work. They laid aside their minor differences, and yes, they must have had them. There were, in a sense, those racial tensions, those tribal rivalries, but they were all laid to rest, such that they could unite in a common cause. Now, I'm not suggesting here that we join the ecumenical movement. We can't do that. We have to stand for truth. We have to stand for righteous things, for holiness, for the pure gospel. But there are things sometimes that divide believers which are so secondary and unimportant, and yet they become a barrier to united service. Oh, well, I would get involved in the Sunday school, but not if he's the superintendent, not if she's teaching. I just don't get on with her, so people might say. So let's be upbraided by the unity of these Perizzites and Jebusites. There's a reminder here that the enemies of the believer and the enemies of the church come in all sorts and all shapes and sizes. Remember, this is a book that teaches about spiritual warfare. And look at this first verse. The kings which were on this side of Jordan, in the hills, in the valleys, in all the coasts, all the various tribes, it was a motley selection of enemies. And the old writers sometimes say how true that is of the enemies of the Christian. There are the lusts of the flesh, there's false teaching, there's violent persecutors, there's false accusers, the scornful scientists who are disparaging about those things that we believe. We have to be alert and ready for all kinds of opposition and all strains and shapes of resistance. How much we need the Lord, as Joshua would need the Lord here, to encounter all those that were now united and gathering their forces for one great act of resistance, which they hoped would finally thwart the Israelites. But I want to look at these opening verses in a different way, really. Here is a picture of some who resist the gospel and the cause of Christ. Here were people who in effect said, well, the Israelites have just renewed their covenant. They anticipate securing the whole of Canaan for the name of God. But we're not going to yield. We're not going to allow them that conquest. And that's the spirit of some when they hear the gospel. Christ is declared as the King of Kings, the one who has a claim upon my life, my soul, my affections, my mind. But I'm not going to yield. We will not have this man to reign over us, said the men in the parable, Luke 19, verse 14, I think it is. Despite here the full knowledge that these people had, the display of the power of God, that power that opened Jordan such that they would go over on dry land, the power that had been displayed at Jericho, and all the historical events, the parting of the Red Sea, the conquest of Og and Sihon, the kings of the other side of the River Jordan. And yet despite all that display of God's power and the folly that they had in resisting such a God, the naivety, the presumption, it's here. And so often that's the case with those that resist and hold out against the Lord. They might be right late in life. Can they escape the grim reaper, death? It's the hand of the Lord that brings our sinful life to an end? Of course not. So let me challenge any here this evening who've never truly humbled themselves and sought God's mercy. Why do you hold out? Do you think that you have more hope of resisting the judgment of God than these ancient Canaanites? You don't. There's another reason why the Lord permits all these Canaanites here to rise up in rebellion. It will demonstrate that his judgment is just. They resist him, they attack the Israelites, but God's judgment is just. So there's pictures here, there's lessons here for us. But then we come, and we'll spend much more time on this, to another group of people who hear the same things that the first group did, that Israel by faith anticipates securing the whole of Canaan, the triumph of God over these immoral and grossly wicked tribes, but they react in a different way. They seek to preserve their life by deception and fraud. Matthew Henry says, as they reviewed their hopeless condition, it was the only game in town. They would either have to come and hope to deceive Joshua into making a pledge to preserve their life and cast themselves upon God's mercy, or they would die anyway. What can we learn from these Gibeonites? Well, there's more than one lesson, more than one strand to suggest lessons for us in these verses. The first is this: we must beware deception in our own life. Joshua, man of God, captain through whom great victories had recently been secured, is deceived by these Gibeonites. Pastors need to be aware. Church officers need to be aware. There are those who are graceless souls, but they deceive the church. They enter. They have all the appearance of sincerity. Their lives are so arranged as you think they're Christians. You think they're converts. And yet they're not. They're very different. Sometimes in the believer's life, our own inward corruptions can wear the guise of virtue. For example, self-promotion. Somebody who wants to promote themselves, get a following, get adulation. How do they appear in the church sometimes? As very zealous. A zeal for the Lord. Remember Jehu? Jehu invited the prophet, come up into the chariot. It may not have been a prophet, I can't remember. But he said, come, see my zeal for the Lord. And he rode furiously. But Jehu really was a man who was keen to promote his own renown. He wanted people to admire him and commend him and congratulate him for what he had done and for what he was doing. And we need to be watchful, because sometimes it may be in our own lives we deceive ourselves. We think that the way we're conducting ourselves is a paragon of virtue, but actually deep down we're motivated by some sin, by pride, by vanity. We want people to love us and to approve of us. And we do all sorts of things that appear sincere and noble and virtuous, but deep down we want people to, oh, what fine Christian that person is. They live close to the Lord, don't they? They know their Bible well. Well, it may be all of those things, but occasionally it might simply be that we're trying to con people into thinking we're more holy than we are. But let's come back to this first lesson here: beware of deception. And we see how the narrative unfolds. And there's some classic hallmarks here of how a deceiver gets away with his crime. Firstly, it was flattery. They came, verse 4, they came as ambassadors from afar. The picture here is of people coming with they're important people. They're coming from afar because they've heard of the renown of the God of Israel. And so they begin to flatter the princes. Oh, we've heard all about you. We know how mighty and glorious your God is. We think it's best that we come and make ourselves vassals and serve you. But it was flattery. Pastors need to be careful here sometimes, because people will flatter a pastor. Oh, pastor, I've come. I've heard your preaching is good. Or a church may be flattered. Oh, we've heard all about you. Heard you're a church that's really doing the Lord's work. And you're walking in a holy manner. You're such a welcoming group. We want to come among you. Well, it may be they do. Maybe they're sincere. But sometimes people flatter, and we need to be a little guarded, more guarded perhaps than Joshua was here. But then, secondly, they were pretenders. They pretended to poverty and need. They came with all their ragged clothes. Matthew Henry says, what was their punishment? Well, they came wearing rags, and they were told that though their life would be spared, they would have to live the rest of their life wearing rags. They would be the most poor of the servant class, hewers of wood and carriers of water. And so, in a sense, the Lord justly honoured their deception. But we must beware. Sometimes people can pretend to be something that they're not. Thirdly, they profess respect for the Lord. Now, this is not entirely untrue. They believed sufficiently to fear for their lives. And yet, did they truly at this point love the Lord God of Israel? Or was it a professed fear of God that was just expedient? Well, it suits us to be seen as God-fearing souls. You know, Israel here was on new territory. When you're in new territory, you're vulnerable to misjudge things. I'm going to apply these verses in a minute to guidance and seeking the Lord's will. And we need to be particularly aware of how vulnerable we are when we're in new company or new territory. We can misjudge characters. We can misjudge our situation. It's all new to us. And here were Israel. They were on the march in Canaan. It was new to them. And whilst it was new to them, they didn't know perhaps the dialect. They didn't know the accents. They didn't pick up that these Gibeonites were only living a few miles off. And there's a warning there to us. When you're on new territory, be acutely aware of your vulnerability. Fifthly, sometimes surprise might deceive us. How surprised the princes were here when they were flattered. They were told, we want to be your servants. We're willing to be your servants. And it must have surprised them. Sort of a kind of staggering, overwhelming sense of, whoa, here are people that are so attracted to us, so fearful of our God, we haven't even got to conquer them. They've come to us and pledged themselves as servants, as slaves. And sixthly here, how plausible they are. You notice when they speak in verse 10, in verses 9 and 10, they say, we've heard of the fame of your God, what he did in Egypt, and what he did to the two kings of the Amorites. They were very careful here, how subtle they were. They didn't say, what was actually in their head, we've heard what the Lord's done to Jericho so recently, because that wouldn't have been consistent with their story. Their story was, well, we've come from afar. If they'd have said, well, we heard what you did last week in Jericho, wasn't quite last week, but you understand what I mean, then Joshua might have smelt a rabbit and thought, how did they know what happened at Jericho? If they came from hundreds of miles away, they wouldn't have known that. How subtle, how plausible they were. So there's a warning here, beware of being deceived. We come to Joshua then, verse 9, verse 10. We're told here, we're going back to earlier verses, verse 8. Joshua is a sincere leader. We're not, this chapter doesn't call us to suggest that Joshua had backslidden in some way, that he was not walking with the Lord, that he was not, in many respects, a godly leader. But sincerity wasn't enough. He needed something more. They even suspect deception. Verse 7, the men of Israel said, how do we know that you don't just live down the road? That's what the phrase here means. Perhaps you dwell among us. Perhaps your neighbours. How do we know that your story is true? And Joshua then adds, verse 8, well, who are you? Where do you come from? So They suspected it. He was watchful. He was guarded. And yet he still falls for the deception. Why? Well, verse 14 is the crux of the matter. That's why I took it as a text. The men took of their victuals, their provisions, and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. The reason that they fell for this ruse was that they didn't seek the Lord. They didn't ask counsel of him. The margin, if you've got one, rephrases this verse slightly differently. They received the men by reason of their provisions. They judged them by their senses. Some say it means here, well, they picked up the bread and they examined it. They tasted it to see whether it really was mouldy. They were judging by sense. In fact, even the Gibeonites here, they said, behold, look, use your own eyes. You can see that we've come from many miles away. Look at our clothes, look at our shoes, look at our wineskins. But that was the problem. They allowed themselves to judge by reason of their senses, what seemed right, what appeared right. Everything seemed so obvious and straightforward and plausible. They didn't bother. Joshua didn't bother seeking the Lord. There's a warning here when it comes to guidance. Sometimes we can be in a situation and we can say to ourselves, well, it's obvious what I've got to do next. The choices seem clear-cut. The right path seems absolutely clear and obvious. And we forget to seek the Lord. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. In all thy ways. Not just when you come to those moments where you're not sure, should I go this way, should I go that way? Should I take this job or that job? And it seems so obvious. Everything seems to be falling into place. Even when everything seems plain and clear, seek the Lord. Joshua got his fingers burnt here. You could say, and the princes did. The lesson that they would say if they were going to give one, even when you think you've got it right, be open to the fact that you might be being misled. You might be deceived. You might be directed just by your senses and by your hunch. And sometimes we do have to use reason. There is that inner persuasion, but be very careful. We have to be guided by seeking the Lord. Lord, help me. We seek the Lord by prayer, committing ourselves to him honestly, humbly, open-mindedly. We come to his word. We ask him to direct us, show us the principles, examine our hearts, motives, what's really right. Why do I want this position? Why am I making this decision? Am I being motivated by earthly considerations alone? Or am I seeking truly to honor the Lord and please him? So there's great lessons here, and the overarching lesson of this verse is beware of rash decisions. Joshua had to suffer a rocky little ride as a result of the decision that he really oversaw with the help of the princes of Israel in this chapter. So you see what happened. They looked at these things, but what happened next? There was a murmuring amongst the princes, the children, against the princes. Verse 18. So they discovers after a few days that they've been deceived. And then you can imagine the congregation. What are our leaders doing? They've received these men, and now we know they're frauds, they're fakes. They're not who they said they are. Why didn't our leaders scrutinize the situation more? Why didn't they make a better decision? And there's murmuring. Often people murmur when their leaders make wrong decisions, and they think that their leaders are worse than they really are. Joshua here had come to a wrong decision, but he had consulted all the princes. There's a lesson there for pastors. Consult your elders. Don't just think you're right and go ahead. Take soundings. But Joshua did that. He didn't do that much wrong, really, but it led to a murmuring. And sometimes Matthew Henry says the people murmur, and they don't recognize that even though the wrong decision has been made, the leaders were very sincere. But they're still men. They still sometimes get things wrong, but we don't question Joshua's sincerity. And many a pastor has been given a real ribbing for a wrong decision, but he was sincere. He was walking with the Lord, but there was a shortfall in his vigilance. He didn't seek the Lord as he should. Now we look at these Gibeonites because, remarkably, they saved themselves. When all the Canaanites will be put to the sword according to the divine justice and execution that he had prescribed, these Gibeonites, they saved themselves. Matthew Henry says, you note their falsehood and their faith. There's a mixture of the two. It was faith that would lead them to surrender. They believed that the God of Israel, who had appointed that the people of Israel would conquer the land, they believed that. They were so sure that it would happen that they go and yield themselves to the people of Israel. And in a sense, they yield themselves to the God of Israel by so doing. So it was faith that would lead them to surrender, but it was the limit of their faith that would lead them to act fraudulently. Does that make sense? If their faith had been greater, they would have said, the God of Israel is mighty. He's appointed us to judgment, but we believe he's also a merciful God. And if we go in genuine repentance and we yield ourselves, trusting to his mercy, he will spare us. They didn't have that level of faith, but they had enough faith that would carry them to stand before Joshua. It was a case of, in one sense, we can but try. We venture. And we see, if we hold out, if we follow the crowd, like the other Canaanites, we're going to lose our lives. We believe that. And so they were a mixture of faith and little faith. But their faith, in some ways, is commendable. They don't follow the rest of the Canaanites. The rest of the Canaanites, they're defiant. They dig their heels in. They're going to hold out in rebellion. But these believe the word of God sufficiently to know that's a hopeless cause. Do we know that? When we reflect upon our lives, do we fear the mighty God of heaven and say, I must seek him? I'm not sure he'll have me, that he'll be merciful to me, but I must try. Matthew Henry says, let us imitate these Gibeonites and make our peace with God in the rags of humiliation, godly sorrow, mortification, so our iniquity shall not be our ruin. Let us be servants to Jesus, our blessed Joshua, and make a league with him and the Israel of God, and we shall live. A treaty is made. And there's some remarkable lessons in this league or treaty that Joshua makes. unwisely, but he makes it all the same. And the first thing you can say is it was generous. The Lord's divine hand overruled in this situation, and you could say by the climate of the day, what a generous settlement this was for the Gibeonites. They'd come fraudulently. They'd come as fakes. And yet they secure safety from the destruction that was about to be unleashed upon Canaan. It was ratified by an oath. Joshua gives his word. The princes of Israel, they give their word. And that would lead to safety. But there's some lessons here as we draw to a conclusion. And the first is this: the importance of keeping our promises. I suppose you could say there's a slightly prior lesson, and that is be careful what you promise. Joshua promised these Gibeonites who were just down the road, their lives would be spared. They would accept them as servants. It's important that we think about promises that we make to one another. If you're thinking about marriage, are you ready to give that word of oath that you will be loyal to your spouse till death parts you? We must be sure that we're ready. Do we respect that man that we contemplate marrying sufficient to make that pledge? As husbands or future husbands, are we ready to say concerning a young woman, I will love her? Whatever flaws, whatever faults, whatever weaknesses present themselves, I will love her until the end. We have to be careful what promises we make. But we're told here, if I can find the verse 20, they said, we will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swear unto them. They fear to break this oath. Why? Because they are men of God. They know that they are the children of God, and they gave their word in the name of God. Verse 18, they had sworn, they said unto them, by the Lord God of Israel. They were, in a sense, ambassadors of God. They represented God. When they gave that promise, that oath, they had to give it and honor it, even though it would cost them, even though the people were murmuring. You know, sometimes if we're pastors and church officers, we can make a decision, we give a promise, and then people complain, and I best change my mind. But if we've made a pledge, we have to keep it. Same in family life. We honor the pledges that we make. Even though it came about by deception, they kept their promise. So why was it? Just thinking about this a little bit more in detail, why was it here that Joshua and the princes kept this promise, even though it had been secured by deception? Well, it reminded the people, and it reminds us how highly God expects us to keep our word. This was at the very beginning of the nation of Israel settled in Canaan. They'd just made those pledges at Mount Ebal. And one of those pledges was that you're faithful. You don't commit adultery. The opposite of that is you keep your word, you keep your promises. This is part of the very fabric of church life, of family life, of our relationship to the Lord, of our testimony in the world. We give our word to the best of our ability, even if it costs us and we regret making that promise, we keep it. We can't say, oh, it doesn't suit me anymore. I didn't realize it was going to have all these implications. We have to keep our word. But also, it was important here because it honored and it advertised the honor of the Lord, the character of the Lord. It established his very nature. What fame emanated from the Gibeonites? What renown to the Lord? They came deceivingly, but the Lord's people gave their word and they kept it. Did the Gibeonites deserve this? Well, you could argue that it was a false, they secured it under false pretenses. And as a result, it could have been justly set aside. But for the sake of the Lord, who is merciful, who is generous, who is magnanimous, they keep the word. They keep the promise. One more lesson, just as we close. We see here the mercy of the Lord, but we also see the equity of the Lord. And what I mean by that is here at the end of this chapter, they take these men at their word. You wanted to be servants? Well, you'll be servants. Hewers of wood and drawers of water. Sometimes the Lord saves us from a wretched life. But he does not always excuse us from the consequences, the earthly consequences of our past sins. They suffered for their fraud. Yes, they secured by it their life, but they had to suffer the consequences. Joshua said, "You're cursed, and you'll be bondmen." David was forgiven his sin of adultery, but he didn't escape the earthly consequences. The sword shall not depart from thy house. There will be family troubles as a result. David tasted God's mercy, but the Lord, to preserve the honor of his own laws, often sees to it that even Christians suffer the consequences of their past life of sin, only the earthly consequences. It may mean that there are scars in our life that they take a long time to heal. And we're reminded of that here, such that we are cautious. We don't sin carelessly. Well, the Lord may forgive me that sin of carelessness if I casually carry on sinning, but if I'm one of his children, he may appoint that I suffer the earthly consequences, just to make us cautious and watchful. But there was a silver lining. Yes, they had to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, but do you notice where? In the house of my God, for the congregation that gathered at the Lord's house. This is a glimpse of a great privilege. They came, in a sense, and their life was spared by little faith mixed with deceit, but the Lord in his mercy takes them into amongst his people, and they end up being what would later be known apparently as the Nethinims, those who were the helpers of the Levites and the priests. So here's a token, a display of God's mercy and grace. It didn't begin well for them, in one sense. It was better than to be left as Canaanites, rebelling against the Lord. They come amongst the Israelites, they secure the pledge, but God keeps his word. He keeps his promises. And though they suffer for their sins, they enjoy the tokens of his mercy. Well, we close our worship this evening. We sing together hymn 452. 452, Love Divine, all loves excelling, Joy of heaven to earth come down. 452.